Hey guys, tonight we're starting a journey across centuries of human guesswork, ingenuity, and an absolute refusal to admit we're lost. Imagine yourself barefoot on the hot stones of ancient Egypt, the Nile shimmering in the distance, sandals slapping softly as you step into the shadow of a tall wooden stick jammed into the ground. That's it. That's your tool. You squint at the way its shadow stretches across the sand, and just like that, you're measuring the earth. Or pretending to. Because tonight you're going to discover how people figured out where they were going, long before they had Google Maps to reroute them after a wrong turn at a camel. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to hear how the world ticks, especially as we're about to dive into a time when what time is it? Required a sundial, a good memory, and the right kind of shadow. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The heat's already starting to rise from the baked stone courtyard. You're in the shade of a temple, perhaps in Thebes, maybe Memphis, and a priest in linen robes is arranging obelisks and sticks like it's a sacred game of pick-up sticks. You don't know it yet, but these people have been watching shadows for thousands of years. Their whole agricultural calendar depends on when the sun crosses certain points in the sky. And the priests? They've turned shadow watching into a career path. You kneel beside one of them. He gestures silently to the stick, the gnomon. You look down at its shadow and watch it shrink and grow with the passing minutes, as if the earth itself is breathing. That shadow isn't just a curiosity, it's how they tell time. More importantly, it's how they track the seasons, know when to plant and when the Nile will flood. The Egyptians built pyramids aligned so precisely with cardinal directions that scholars today still argue whether they used stars, sun shadows, or sheer cosmic luck. But in this moment, it feels like they've mastered something you haven't. Imagine building the Great Pyramid and getting the base aligned within a fraction of a degree using nothing but ropes, sticks, and celestial guesswork. Meanwhile, you still get lost in your own apartment building when the lights go out. One mainstream historical fact stands tall here. Literally. The Egyptians used a merket, a simple instrument made of string and weights, to line up with the North Star. Combine that with a plumb line and the sacred geometry of shadow lengths, and boom, you're essentially working with the world's earlier survey toolkit. No batteries required. It's all rather poetic too. The way these ancient builders let the sky shape the earth. And sure, the pharaoh gets all the credit, but it's really the guy with the stick and the notebook. Well, okay, papyrus. Who does the hard work. You follow the priest deeper into the temple complex. He stops and points to a slab where tiny carvings mark solstices and equinoxes. You trace them with your fingers, feeling the indentation of someone's ancient timekeeping efforts. There's no GPS voice telling you to proceed to the route. Instead, the route is carved in stone and tracked by the heavens. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some early Egyptian tombs contain carvings of people with unusually long arms, leading some fringe theorists to suggest they were stylized representations of people measuring things. Long arms for long measurements, obviously. Or maybe the artist just had a thing for funky proportions. Art students have been winging it since forever. You sit beneath a column and sip water from a ceramic cup, thinking about how this civilization laid out their entire society based on where the sun fell at certain times of day. Calendars, festivals, taxes, all linked to the position of light and shadow. Historians still argue whether the earliest Egyptians actually understood the curvature of the earth. Some claim they did, based on the geometry used in their large-scale construction. Others argue it's coincidence. After all, build enough stuff and eventually some of it will accidentally be aligned with a star. Still, there's something comforting in watching people long before you take the time to measure things carefully. Even if their methods were wildly inefficient by modern standards, they cared. They noticed. They stood still in a sunlit courtyard and watched a shadow move inch by inch. And honestly, that's more than most of us do on any given Tuesday. You rise as the sun climbs higher. The shadow shortens, then lengthens in the opposite direction. The priest nods, satisfied. Another measurement taken. Another invisible line drawn between earth and sky. You leave the temple, stepping into a world that no longer feels quite so uncharted. You can almost feel the grid beneath your feet, the imagined lines, the sacred angles. And as you walk past a stoneworker chiseling new glyphs into a wall, you notice his tools. Simple, ancient, utterly effective. Turns out you don't need a satellite to know where you are, just a shadow, a steady hand, and the patience to wait. The dust gets into your sandals again, and you sigh, quietly, because you're now in Babylon, and complaining too loudly might get you assigned to brick duty. The sun is hot, yes, but the air smells faintly of date syrup and freshly turned soil. You're in the middle of one of the most advanced cities on Earth, and you're about to meet the original number nerds of Mesopotamia. You shuffle past the ziggurat shadow, still amazed it doesn't topple over, despite looking like a giant wedding cake made of mud. But here's the thing. These people knew exactly what they were doing, because Babylonian surveyors, working thousands of years before GPS, were already experts at measuring land, mapping plots, and figuring out how many barley bushels you owed the king. Hint, it's always more than you think. You're led to a small workshop near the temple district, where a group of scribes sits cross-legged over clay tablets. No glowing screens here, just wet clay and a stylus that looks like a chewed-up popsicle stick. One scribe grunts at you to sit, then begins showing off one of their most prized possessions, a land record. Lines, angles, symbols. You're staring at a cadastral map older than almost every religion. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Babylonian land surveyors used a base 60 numbering system. That's right. While you're still trying to divide a dinner check 3 ways with decimals, they were crushing trigonometry using sexagesimal math. It's the same system that gives us 60 minutes in an hour and 360 degrees in a circle. If that makes your head spin, it's okay. Theirs probably did too, just with more cuneiform. The map in front of you details a boundary dispute. Apparently a farmer named Ibn Sin claimed his neighbour's canal flooded his lentil patch. The scribe explains, between bites of a fig, that measuring these plots involved stretching ropes, placing boundary stones, and recording distances with astonishing accuracy. Some fringe interpretations suggest they even adjusted for slope, which if true, means you now owe your high school geometry teacher a big apology. The workshop smells of clay and oil lamp smoke, and outside you hear the occasional bray of a donkey or shout from a passing merchant. Babylon isn't just a city, it's a living, breathing math experiment, and every street corner has its own unique flavour of confusion. You move outside and follow a pair of surveyors lugging measuring ropes and a suspiciously heavy basket. They're on their way to mark off a temple donation, land given by a wealthy patron hoping to snag a slightly better seat in the afterlife. The surveyors stretch their rope taut between wooden stakes, muttering about cubits and palm widths. You pretend to understand. Here's a quirky tidbit. Mesopotamian measuring ropes were often knotted at standard intervals, but over time, ropes stretch. So some surveyors allegedly cheated the system by moistening the ropes, so they'd contract and accidentally change property lines in their client's favour. Ah yes, the noble tradition of shady land dealings, older than sliced bread. Historians still argue whether these early maps were symbolic, functional, or both. Some claim they were more about showing who owned the land than navigating it. Others believe they were practical guides, complete with scale and direction. The truth is probably somewhere in between, because this is ancient Mesopotamia, and nuance is the name of the game. As the sun begins to set, you return to the temple complex. Along the way, you pass a wall carving that seems to depict a river flowing between 2 plots of land, labelled with symbols and measurements. One carving shows a man holding a rod and a rope, standing triumphantly over what appears to be a cow. Maybe he measured the cow, maybe he was celebrating a successful boundary negotiation, or maybe the artist just thought cows were hilarious. We'll never know. You sit by a shallow canal, feet dangling in the cool water. A child walks by, dragging a stick behind him that carves a perfectly straight line in the dust. You smile. Somewhere in this ancient land of beer, gods, and math, that kid might grow up to be a rope-stretching, angle-measuring, cow-surveying land guru, and in 1,000 years some future human will probably be doing the same thing, minus the clay tablets plus a satellite or 2. Still, as you lean back and watch the water reflect the early stars, there's something grounding about knowing that even before smartphones, humans were already obsessed with figuring out exactly how big their backyard was and whether their neighbour stole that fig tree. You close your eyes, and Babylon hums softly in the background. The measuring never really stops. You rub your eyes against the rising sun as you cross the sea, the ancient Aegean breeze brushing past your face, carrying the scent of salt and something vaguely olive. The world has shifted again. This time, you're in Greece. Not the Instagrammable Santorini kind, but the dusty, tunic-clad, philosophical, bickering sort of Greece, where people spend their mornings arguing about triangles and their evenings inventing democracy by accident. You're in Cyrene, a sun-baked city on the edge of North Africa. Today, you're meeting Eratosthenes, a man who somehow used shadows and camel roots to measure the earth, and who probably didn't even spill a single drop of wine while doing it. The heat is already licking at the stone steps as you sit beside a shallow sundial. Eratosthenes, chief librarian of Alexandria, part-time mathematician, full-time overachiever, leans toward you and grins. He asks you to look at a stick. Again. That's apparently tonight's recurring theme, sticks. But this one's special. In Syene, far to the south, the sun shines straight down at noon. Here in Cyrene, it casts a shadow. That difference? That's geometry. That's earth math. Mainstream historical fact, Eratosthenes used the angle of that shadow, about 7.2 degrees, and the distance between Syene and Alexandria to calculate the circumference of the Earth. His result was eerily close to modern estimates. This was over 2,000 years ago. Meanwhile, you still miss highway exits even with 3 GPS voices shouting in harmony. As you follow him through the colonnades of the city, he explains his method again, just in case you forgot how clever he is. He hired a traveller to pace the distance between the two cities, roughly 5,000 stadia, give or take a few camel blisters. Then he used proportions to estimate the Earth's full circumference. No globe, no lasers, just shadows, distance, and boldness. You pause beside a fountain and sip cool water. A donkey snorts in the background. You ask, half joking, how he knows the Earth is round. He rolls his eyes so hard you're briefly worried they'll get stuck. Ships disappear bottom first over the horizon, he mutters. And besides, have you ever seen a square moon? Quirky tidbit time. Eratosthenes was nicknamed Beta by some of his less charitable peers. Not because he was a beta male. No, that nonsense hadn't been invented yet, but because he was second best at everything. Second best poet, second best philosopher, second best geographer. Tough crowd. Of course, when your second best guess about the size of the planet ends up being basically correct, you sort of win the long game. You stroll with him to the edge of the city, where he's carved crude diagrams in the dirt. Circles, triangles. The Earth sketched like a child's drawing, but in his hands, it breathes. It works. You crouch and trace the angles with your finger, feeling the warmth of the ground seep into your skin. Historians still argue whether his measurements were as accurate as they seemed, or if he just got lucky with the assumed distance between cities. Some say his numbers were wildly off but balanced out by coincidence. Others insist he must have had access to better data than we give him credit for. Either way, the fact that he even attempted this feat with nothing but math and shadows is enough to make you reconsider how you use your afternoon. A chorus of cicadas rises from the trees, and you find yourself lulled by the rhythm of it all, math as music, Earth as a slow-spinning stage. You sit back, legs stretched across a low stone wall, and gaze at the horizon. The world feels smaller now, more knowable. Later you'll wander back through the olive groves and whitewashed homes, nodding to passing fishermen and idle philosophers. You'll think about how Eratosthenes never actually left his region, yet still measured the whole planet. It's comforting in a way. You don't have to go everywhere to understand everything. Sometimes it's enough to just watch a shadow move and do the math. You yawn. Somewhere in the distance, a student miscalculates a right angle and gets whacked with a scroll. The geometry of the Earth is sleepy work. You're tired, dusty, and mildly sunburned from all the shadow chasing, but there's no rest yet. Because now you've landed in ancient China, and here things are different. The city of Luoyang hums around you, vibrant with carts, incense, and arguments over tea. This isn't just a place of trade and tradition, it's where imperial officials attempt the impossible, mapping a kingdom so vast that even the sky seems too small to hold it. You stand beneath a red-lacquered gate, listening to the clack of wooden sandals on cobblestone, when someone tugs your sleeve and points toward the surveyor's bureau. Inside, scrolls are everywhere. They curl like sleeping dragons across the room, filled with neat rows of characters and delicate lines tracing mountains, rivers, and border walls. This is where the Emperor's reach is calculated, through string, ink, and the endless pursuit of order. Because when you rule a land as large as Han China, knowing exactly where your rice fields, tax zones and rebellious provinces are, that's not just handy, it's survival. Mainstream historical fact. Chinese engineers during the Han Dynasty developed remarkably advanced tools for measuring distance and elevation, including a proto-odometer mounted on carts that dropped wooden pegs at fixed intervals. If that sounds suspiciously modern, it's because it kind of is. The mechanism involved gears and turning wheels. So yes, while you're here drooling over spicy noodles, someone is literally reinventing the speedometer 2 millennia early. A court official unrolls a map for you, its silk surface inked with mountains and meticulous straight lines. These lines, they're part of a gridded system used to divide the empire into administrative units, each measured and recorded with such discipline it makes modern zoning laws look like a guessing game. You glance at one of the copper measuring rods hanging on the wall. These were standard lengths issued to officials, ensuring uniformity across the empire. But here's a quirky tidbit. The emperor's personal rod was deliberately a little longer. Because of course it was. Power, after all, is knowing that your foot outranks everyone else's. As you watch two scribes argue over whether a hillside village falls in County A or County B, you realise you're watching early bureaucracy in action. Ink-stained fingers jab at coordinates. Someone starts drawing triangles. There's cursing. And finally, someone fetches the measuring ropes. You follow them into the field, literally. You trudge behind a trio of government surveyors measuring a rice paddy. One walks ahead, unwinding rope knotted at regular intervals. Another drops red wooden stakes. The third holds up a flag and squints at the sun like he's trying to read its mood. They're not just doing math, they're reinforcing imperial control, plot by plot. Because every field measured means more accurate taxes. Every accurate tax means a slightly less cranky emperor. And slightly less cranky emperors are the difference between a golden age and a dig-your-own-grave kind of situation. Historians still argue whether Chinese maps of this era were based on actual measurement or a blend of data and artistic interpretation. Some believe they used astronomical observation to plot cardinal directions. Others say much of it was symbolic, designed to look official even if no one had ever measured the thing it depicted. But in a way, that doesn't matter. The ambition was real. The process mattered. It showed that people, somewhere, in some dusty village or bustling court, were always trying to bring order to chaos. You sit beneath a tree and watch the surveyors at work. The afternoon heat curls through the valley and the sun casts long golden shadows. Someone waves a fan lazily. A child with a stick mimics the surveyors, drawing crooked lines in the dirt. You remember Eratosthenes' shadow stick, the Babylonian rope, the Egyptian obelisk. It's all echoing, spiralling forward in time. Different civilizations, same obsession. Where am I? How far is that mountain? Who owns this acre? You exhale slowly. Maybe if you sit still long enough, someone will come along and measure you. Just for the record, of course. You're wading through tall, whispering reeds now, this time in ancient Egypt, where the Nile yawns lazily beneath a copper-hued sky. The river flows like a heartbeat through the land, reliable but mischievous, flooding when it pleases, changing the shape of everything. And that's where your current adventure begins, with water, mud, and the desperate Egyptian need to measure land that keeps rearranging itself. You're perched on the edge of a field near Memphis. Not the Elvis kind, the one with papyrus scrolls and sun gods. Every year the Nile floods and wipes out all visible boundary markers, and every year a team of surveyors, called rope stretchers, goes out to redraw the map. It's like doing your taxes while the paper's still on fire. Mainstream historical fact, the ancient Egyptians developed sophisticated surveying techniques to remeasure and redistribute farmland after each inundation. They used knotted ropes, right-angle triangles, and even simple sighting tools to restore field boundaries with surprising precision. Which, when you consider they were often working knee-deep in silt, is either brilliant or slightly masochistic. One surveyor shows you his tools, a coiled rope marked at regular intervals and a wooden sighting gnomon. You hold one end while he stretches it taut across the soggy field. You're supposed to stand still, but the mud sucks at your sandals like an overly affectionate toddler and you almost topple. Balance, he mutters, barely looking up. You don't want to throw off the pharaoh's wheat count. Quirky tidbit. These rope stretchers didn't just measure land, they were practically land lawyers. Their decisions could determine how much tax a farmer owed, or whether a family got to keep the land their ancestors had ploughed for generations. Some records show intense legal disputes erupting over just a few cubits of dirt. The Nile may have been sacred, but property lines. That was where things got serious. You trek with the team through fields of barley and flax, your robe sticking uncomfortably to your legs. At one point, a heron glares at you like you just insulted its dynasty. The surveyors are arguing now. One thinks the corner of the field should angle southwest. The other swears it always pointed south-southeast. They drop to the ground and start marking triangles in the dirt with the reeds. You offer a helpful shrug. They ignore you. Historians still argue whether the ancient Egyptian understanding of geometry was purely practical, or if it fed into their more mystical ideas of order and balance. Some believe that land measurement wasn't just about administration. It was a way of maintaining Mahat, the cosmic harmony. If the fields were incorrectly measured, the world itself might tilt out of balance. So yes, that patch of onions might be all that's holding the universe together. Later, you follow them back toward the edge of the village. Someone set up a temporary tax tent, basically a bureaucratic lemonade stand, where farmers line up to argue their newly measured boundaries. A priest records the data on papyrus, muttering prayers between brushstrokes. You watch as he sketches a basic map, just a few lines and dots, but it's enough. Enough to declare what belongs to whom, enough to decide how much grain gets hauled off to the temples, and as the sun sinks low, casting long golden rays across the Nile, you catch sight of a half-submerged boundary marker. Just a humble stone poking from the mud. It's easy to miss, but to the Egyptians, it's sacred. A pin in the living map of a nation constantly remade by water and sweat. You sit beside it, watching a boat drift slowly upriver, its sail slack in the breeze. Someone laughs from a nearby hut. A goat bleats. A child uses a reed to draw wobbly squares in the sand, mimicking the surveyors. You wonder if they'll argue over his land in 1,000 years. Probably. You're ankle-deep in fine red dust now, watching it swirl around your toes like dry smoke. The air smells of sandalwood and cumin, and in the distance a peacock screeches with the kind of confidence only a bird with an iridescent tail can muster. Welcome to ancient India, where measuring the world means balancing the stars, the sacred, and sometimes a very literal cow. You're standing at the edge of a stepped temple in the Maurya Empire, maybe around the 3rd century BCE. Somewhere nearby, scholars are reciting Sanskrit verses, lines that carry astronomical formulas wrapped in poetry. You rub your temples. They've managed to make math rhyming. You suddenly feel underqualified. Mainstream historical fact. Ancient Indian scholars were among the first to use remarkably accurate trigonometric calculations to chart celestial events and measure terrestrial distances. Aryabhata, centuries later, would go on to propose that the Earth spins on its axis and calculate the value of pi to several decimal places, all without a telescope. But long before him, the Vedas were already describing cosmic distances and heavenly cycles using units like the yojana and krosa, which range from practical to weight. How many elephants long is that? You're guided through a courtyard by a priest astronomer. Yes, that's a job title. He explains how rituals needed perfect timing and placement, which meant precise astronomical measurements were critical. Everything from where to place the sacrificial fire to when to harvest millet depended on aligning human activity with the heavens. You're handed a gnomon, a vertical stick again, because apparently no one's invented measuring tape, and shown how its shadow is used to track the solstice. And here comes the quirky tidbit. Some temple planners laid out sacred structures using a cow to help draw a perfect square. Yes, a cow. They'd walk it around a central pole while tethered, allowing its steps to define the boundaries of the structure. It's called the Godhuli system, cow dust time, when the animal's movement kicks up dusk particles that gently settle over future temples. Imagine explaining that zoning method to a city planner today. You step into the observatory, a raised platform of smooth stone with carved lines etched deep into the floor. It's part altar, part calculator. The scholars here track the movement of stars and planets with nothing but sight lines, shadows, and patience that would terrify modern teenagers. One gently points to a mark, then up to a twinkling dot in the sky. Jupiter, he says, it will rise 35 days earlier next cycle. You smile and pretend to understand. 35 days. Sure. Historians still argue whether early Indian mathematical models influenced Greek or Arabic systems, or whether they emerged independently. Trade, conquest, and cultural exchange certainly muddied the waters. What's clear is that Indian scholars were working with numbers and measurements centuries ahead of their time, writing astronomical treatises that would eventually travel to Baghdad, Cordoba and beyond. You wander with the scribe through fields lined with banyan trees, watching him record survey results on thin palm leaves. He dips his stylus into ink made from burnt husks and mutters as he copies numbers. Land here is measured in units like bigha, but the definitions vary from region to region, king to king. It's not exactly GPS-level accuracy, but you try eyeballing rice fields after a monsoon and see how your data holds up. Even the legal system relies on these measurements. Disputes are settled not in courtrooms, but at the foot of mango trees, where elders compare records, consult astrologers, and sip sweet lime water while deciding whose paddy ends where. You watch one such trial unfold involving two brothers, a stubborn ox, and a property line that allegedly moved on its own. Spoiler, it didn't. As the sky darkens, you sit on the temple steps, watching fireflies drift lazily through the air. A conch shell sounds in the distance. A breeze picks up, scented with night-blooming jasmine. It's all measured. Not just the land, the time, the rituals, the shadows. Everything mapped, not with satellites, but with stars, steps, and sacred rhythms. You lie back on the warm stone and trace constellations above you with your finger. The Earth may be ancient, but it's math, timeless. You're blinking against a sandstorm now, the sun blazing like molten brass overhead. Somewhere in the wind, a camel sneezes. Welcome to the Islamic Golden Age, Baghdad, around the 9th century. You're standing at the gates of the House of Wisdom, and despite the slightly scorched feeling on your scalp, you're about to watch some of the most breathtaking feats of mathematical mapping unfold, with zero help from Google Earth. Inside, the air shifts instantly. Cool marble, incense and scrolls stacked like some divine game of Jenga. Scholars in flowing robes lean over geometric diagrams, while others argue over star charts with the kind of intensity normally reserved for bad board game nights. Here, measuring the Earth isn't just a curiosity, it's a sacred duty, a way to know the mind of God through the architecture of the universe. Mainstream historical fact: Islamic astronomers and geographers of the Abbasid era made massive strides in both practical and theoretical measurement. Al-Khwarizmi, yes, the algebra guy, worked on accurate maps that corrected and expanded on Ptolemy's earlier models. And by worked on, we mean he basically rewrote the known world using Arabic numerals that you casually use to order pizza today. A mathematician hands you an astrolabe, basically a brass handheld model of the heavens. He shows you how to use it to find the Qibla, direction of prayer, tell the time, and measure latitude using the angle of the stars. You nod slowly, pretending you're not about to drop it. It's heavier than it looks, and prettier than your smartphone. Quirky tidbit: some astrolabes included plates for different cities. Slide one out, pop another in, and you've got Baghdad, Cairo, even Cordoba mapped onto your tiny celestial computer. It's like swapping SIM cards in a divine GPS. Later, you ride out with a survey team working under Caliph al-Mamun. Their goal? Measure the actual circumference of the Earth. How? By using trigonometry and walking. Lots and lots of walking. They pick two flat desert points, measure the angle of the sun at both, and then calculate the Earth's size based on how far apart the sites are. Spoiler alert, they come frighteningly close to the actual value, within a few hundred kilometres. Historians still argue whether these calculations were purely mathematical, or if they involved a bit of make the caliph happy rounding. After all, if you were hauling surveying gear across the blazing plains of Sinjar, you'd fudge a number or two for a faster trip home. But the achievement remains staggering. Long before satellites or radio waves, scholars here were using triangles, shadows, and an obsessive love of precision to pin down the spinning ball we all live on. And they weren't just measuring, they were preserving Greek, Persian and Indian knowledge while improving upon it. You follow a young apprentice through the library, where massive globes sit atop pedestals, stars etched in gold. A passing scholar mumbles something about spherical trigonometry, and you decide to pretend it's a poetry style. He hands you a scroll containing a map of the known world. It's not just a pretty drawing, it's a data set. It includes grid coordinates, coastal outlines, river systems, the kind of thing you'd expect from a high-level geography app, except it was drawn with a quill, not a stylus. The cities are marked, the distances measured, the stars aligned, and somewhere deep in the night, atop an observatory tower, A scholar in midnight robes points a quadrant toward the stars and murmurs calculations into the wind. To them, measurement is not just science, it's devotion. A way to read divine intention written in the geometry of the heavens. As you walk back down the spiral steps, dizzy from numbers and perfume, you hear call to prayer echoing across the city. It's perfectly timed. Thanks to those very measurements you just witnessed, everything lines up. Not just the numbers, but the faith, the philosophy, the cosmos itself. You pause at the courtyard fountain, dipping your hands into the water. The stars above you now seem less distant, less abstract. You don't just know where you are. You know why you are. You're squinting through a drizzle now, the kind that makes wool itch and stone paths slick. Welcome to medieval Europe, a continent still clutching its Roman inheritance like an heirloom it doesn't quite understand. Somewhere off in a misty field you hear chanting. Monks, again. They're the unsung heroes of today's journey and surprisingly good at math. You wander through the cloister of an abbey, maybe in France or England or somewhere in the Holy Roman Empire. It's hard to tell with all the fog and Latin mumbling. But one thing is clear. While most of Europe has been busy forgetting things like plumbing and philosophy, these monks have been quietly measuring the world. Mainstream historical fact. Medieval monastic communities preserved much of Roman surveying knowledge, including land division methods like the centuriation system and tools such as the dioptra. Though they didn't always use them to build roads or aqueducts, monks needed to manage land for farming, taxation and tithe collection. Yes, even your cheese tithe had to be geometrically accounted for. You duck into a scriptorium where a brother is hunched over a parchment, tongue sticking out in intense concentration. He's copying a Roman treatise on land surveying, translating it into medieval Latin, which somehow sounds even more cryptic than the original. On the edge of his desk, a dusty tool catches your eye, a wooden frame balanced with strings and pegs. You pick it up. "Don't touch that," he mutters, not looking up. "That's for squaring fields." You back away slowly. He sighs and offers you bread instead. Monks, grumpy but hospitable. Quirky tidbit. In some monastic communities, land was measured using the length of a monk's foot, or even the distance one could walk while reciting a psalm. So yes, some early medieval boundaries were literally determined by how fast Brother Thomas could sing about smiting enemies. You head outside again, where a brother and his apprentice are marking out new garden plots using rods and rope. The apprentice counts paces. The elder holds a wooden square toward the horizon, as if aligning the earth with the sky. They're setting up a new vineyard, and every vine must be spaced just so, for sun, soil, and of course, the spiritual geometry of good wine. Historians still argue whether these early medieval measurements were more symbolic than scientific. Some scholars believe that maintaining sacred proportions mattered more than exact distances, especially in church construction. A chapel might be 7 cubits wide, not because of structural logic, but because 7 was a holy number. If the roof caved in later, well, faith could be a bit fuzzy on structural integrity. You trail behind as the monks move down a dirt road lined with hedgerows. They're headed to a nearby hamlet to resolve a boundary dispute, something about pigs crossing an invisible line. In an era without GPS or even reliable maps, these monks serve as surveyors, mediators, and record keepers. They unroll a vellum scroll showing the manor's lands, crudely drawn, more suggestion than map, but it contains the essentials. A stream, a mill, a patch of forest, where the ghosts live, scribbled in the margins, possibly joking, possibly not. With the sun peeking through the clouds, they measure shadows with a stick to determine east. Old habits die hard. A farmer grumbles that the old hedge line has moved, but the monk gently explains that the earth does not bend for turnips. His apprentice marks the new border with a pile of stones, then whispers a prayer, because when in doubt, bless your measurement. Later, you sit beside a sheep pasture watching the sunset stain the clouds red. A cow walks by. It is completely indifferent to historical progress. The bell tolls from the abbey tower. Vespers. Evening now. You lie back in the grass, half listening to distant chanting. The world is quieter here, slower, but not forgotten, not unmeasured. Even in the depths of a so-called dark age, people were still counting, still carving lines, still trying to make sense of a world that refused to sit still, with nothing but paces, psalms, and prayer. You're on a creaky wooden ship now, and everything smells like salt, rope, and the kind of fish that somehow always manages to rot just a little too early. The ocean churns beneath you like a living thing, and the sky? It's a flat grey dome smeared with gulls. You grip the rail as the ship lurches. Welcome to the age of maritime navigation, where measuring the world depends not on land or stone, but on staying alive long enough to guess where you are. You glance at the navigator, sunburned, squinting, and chewing something that may once have been jerky. He's holding a compass. Yes, a real one. A tiny needle, floating in a dish of murky water, trembling toward the magnetic north. Which, fun fact, isn't where the North Pole actually is. Mainstream historical fact. The compass likely originated in China during the Han Dynasty and made its way westward by the 12th century, transforming how people navigated oceans, deserts, and trade routes. Once mariners figured out they didn't need the sun or stars to know direction, the world suddenly got a lot less terrifying and a lot more explorable. Your captain grunts and gestures toward a stack of charts. They're hand-drawn, filled with swirling coastlines, sea monsters the size of yachts, and poetic warnings like, "Here be dragons." You raise an eyebrow, he shrugs. Better safe than dragon chow. Quirky tidbit. Early sailors often named compass points with phrases like, "wind of the goat," or "wind from the scorpion," before settling on the more boring north-south-east-west model. In fact, before accurate angle measurements, many sailors used rum lines, those radiating spokes on portolan charts, to guess their heading based on wind patterns and what smelled most like home. Below deck, a tired-looking cartographer dips a feathered quill into ink made from boiled oak galls. He's copying a coastline sketch from a Venetian merchant who, rumour has it, once sailed with pirates. You peer closer and notice the landmass looks familiar. Is that Portugal, or a very fat boot? Historians still argue whether early compass navigation was independently developed in Europe or derived directly from Chinese and Islamic sources. What's certain is that once the compass took hold, it quickly became indispensable. Merchants used it, explorers swore by it, and pirates definitely didn't return it when they borrowed one. Up on deck, you spot the helmsman steering not by sight but by feel. He checks the position of the sun with a cross staff, a long ruler-like stick with sliding crosspieces. You try it, squint at the sun, align the crossbar with the horizon, and get blinded. Well, that's unfortunate. You vow to never complain about sunglasses again. The wind picks up. The sails snap taut. You pass a marker buoy and someone yells out a distance, estimated using knots. No, not speed knots. Actual knots. Sailors would throw a rope with evenly spaced knots into the sea and count how many pass through their fingers in a set time. It's where we get the nautical term knots for speed. Also, it's a great way to lose fingers if you're not careful. Night falls, and the stars emerge like pinpricks on a black velvet curtain. The navigator breathes easier. He doesn't trust the compass alone. Too many storms, too many magnetic surprises. The stars, though, those are reliable. He pulls out a nocturnal, essentially a circular disc used to tell time at night by the positions of the Big Dipper and Polaris. You had no idea nighttime clocks were a thing. Now you do. You're officially out of excuses for being late. The ship rocks gently and the sailors settle in. Someone starts humming a sea shanty, badly. You sit at the bow, watching the compass needle wiggle like a dowsing rod. In the distance, the lights of land flicker. You made it. Not because you saw where you were going, but because you trusted invisible forces. A trembling needle, a drifting star, a gut feeling that the world, even when it spins, can still be mapped. And with that, you close your eyes, rocked gently by waves and quiet math. Now you're kneeling on a ship's deck, elbow deep in sea spray and a salty argument about whether that's Corsica or just a weirdly shaped cloud. The compass is still twitching beside you, but the real magic today is spread across the navigator's desk like an ancient treasure map, a portolan chart. This isn't your average scroll of vague coastlines and judgmental sea monsters. It's shockingly accurate, coasts so cleanly drawn, they look traced from a satellite image. But here's the thing. These were made in the 13th and 14th centuries, centuries before anyone could see the Earth from above. Mainstream historical fact. Portolan charts first appeared in the Mediterranean and quickly became essential tools for sailors. They showed coastlines, harbours and prevailing winds with astonishing detail. The earliest surviving example, the Carta Pisana, dates to around 1275. its accuracy still stuns modern historians. Your fingers follow the map's web of lines radiating like a shattered window pane. These are the famous rum lines, compass bearings that help sailors maintain a steady course between ports. The charts don't cover the entire globe, just coastlines, but they do it so precisely that mariners could sail by them confidently, even without seeing land. The odd part: no one really knows how the first Portolan charts were made. There's no written method, no grand geometric theory, just results. Historians still argue whether they were based on practical sailing experience passed down orally, or if a now-lost mathematical technique was behind them. Quirky tidbit: many of these charts were copied by hand, often in lavish style. They included flourishes like compass roses, zodiac signs, and sometimes, because medieval cartographers had flair, a sea unicorn or two. Function and fantasy, perfectly balanced. You climb up to the crow's nest, squinting toward a foggy horizon. Below, the navigator consults his chart, turning it to match the angle of the wind. Unlike later maps, Portolans weren't aligned with north at the top. They were designed to match your ship's heading. Think of them as medieval GPS, but with way more seaweed. You're fascinated by how the cartographer doesn't try to draw inland features. No rivers, no mountains, no cities unless they're ports. It's all about the edges, the skin of the world. Like the map is saying, you don't need to know what's inland, just don't hit it. The ship pulls into a bustling harbour, ropes tossed and voices shouting. A local pilot hops aboard, glances at the chart and nods approvingly. He recognises it instantly. That tells you everything. These charts weren't museum pieces. They were working tools passed between crews, updated with ink and salt-stained fingerprints. Down below deck you find a younger cartographer, probably an apprentice, hunched over a blank sheet of vellum. He's copying the chart by hand, line by trembling line, his ink well dangerously close to tipping. You watch him draw the familiar web of rum lines, then begin tracing the coastline, his hand steady despite the ship's sway. One mistake, and someone could end up beached in the wrong country. Historians still argue whether the mathematical underpinnings of Portolan charts were reverse-engineered later during the Renaissance, or if the medieval sailors were just unrecognised geniuses working on instinct. Either way, the results remain unmatched until the advent of latitude and longitude maps centuries later. You lie back on a coil of rope, listening to the creak of the hull. The chart still lies open nearby, fluttering gently with the sea breeze. You notice a faint ink smudge across a coastline, like a secret note. Maybe it's from a sailor long gone. Maybe it's just a coffee stain. But for a moment it feels like the world makes sense. Coasts edged with ink, stars above, and nothing more complex than choosing the right line to follow. You're back on land now, ducking under an awning in a bustling European port city sometime around the 1500s. The Renaissance is in full swing, and everything smells like ink, ambition, and questionable fish. Merchants shout in 5 languages, scholars carry scrolls like fashion accessories, and somewhere, a man in tights is arguing about Saturn. Amid the chaos, a new obsession is blooming: latitude and longitude. Finally, someone decides that eyeballing a coastline like a drunken crab isn't enough. It's time to pin the Earth down with numbers. Mainstream historical fact: during the Renaissance, European scholars revived and expanded on Ptolemaic geography, striving to divide the Earth with neat grids of latitude, horizontal, and longitude, vertical. Latitude was relatively easy. Just measure the angle of the sun or stars above the horizon. Longitude, however, was a mathematical nightmare that would take centuries, and a lot of broken clocks, to solve. You squint at a globe inside a dusty study. It's one of the first to show America, sort of. It's lumpy, misshapen, and possibly upside down. But it has lines. So many lines. Cartographers are drawing them by hand, hoping that gridding the Earth like a game board will somehow tame it. In the next room, an astronomer tilts a quadrant out a window, measuring the sun's altitude. Below him, a mapmaker slaps down another city on a growing world map with a thud that says, "I hope that's correct." You look closer. It's spelled wrong. Twice. Historians still argue whether the Renaissance explosion of geography was truly a rediscovery of classical knowledge, or something more radical, a reinvention based on New World exploration. After all, when your ships are bumping into continents no one told you about, your maps need some serious updating. Quirky tidbit: some Renaissance cartographers tried to include mythical places, like El Dorado or the Mountains of the Moon, because accuracy is great, but storytelling, even better. There are even maps with warnings like "Here be giants" or "Region of dog-headed men," which sounds like either a cautionary note or a very confusing tourist brochure. You step into a public lecture where a grinning humanist in a feathered cap is explaining how the Earth can now be divided into 360 degrees, each subdivided into minutes and seconds, like a giant cosmic pie chart. The crowd nods politely while trying not to fall asleep. Measuring the world has become high fashion, like alchemy, but with fewer explosions. The printing press hums in the background. With maps now mass-producible, everyone from merchants to monarchs wants their own copy of the known world, even if it's wildly inaccurate. One map even shows California as an island, which is frankly tempting. You wander past an artist's workshop where a chart of the heavens blends into a map of the Earth. The boundary between astronomy and geography is blurred, because at this point no one's quite sure if they're studying the Earth or the divine. Outdoors, a group of sailors is gathered around a newfangled instrument, the astrolabe. Think of it as the iPhone of 1500. It does everything, tells time, measures stars, locates your latitude, and looks fancy while doing it. You try one and immediately drop it. It lands in mud. The navigator sighs. You move on. That night, by candlelight, you watch a scholar compare maps of Ptolemy with those from Portuguese explorers. The differences are stark and unsettling. New lands, unfamiliar coastlines, and oceans far larger than previously imagined. The Earth, once a known sphere with tidy edges, is now sprawling into mystery again, and through it all the grid expands. Latitude lines grow tight with certainty. Longitude, still elusive. But every explorer, every mapmaker, every apprentice with an inkwell and a dream is inching the world closer to something resembling order. You close your eyes beside a glowing globe, tracing your finger along a meridian. The Earth may not sit still, but with enough lines and enough dreams, maybe, just maybe, you can measure it anyway. You lean on a cluttered desk in a candlelit study where scrolls are stacked like miniature towers, threatening to avalanche at any moment. A rolled-up map slips free and unspools across the table, revealing Greenland. Enormous. Ludicrously enormous. In fact, it looks bigger than Africa, and definitely more square than any chunk of frozen wasteland has a right to be. Congratulations, you're holding a Mercator projection. Mainstream historical fact. In 1569, Gerardus Mercator, a Flemish cartographer, unveiled a revolutionary map projection that transformed navigation. It distorted size to preserve angle, meaning that sailors could plot straight-line courses, called rum lines, without constantly correcting direction. It was a masterpiece for mariners, and a nightmare for geographers who cared about proportions. You roll the map back up and immediately knock over a sextant. Oops. Fortunately, the old man nearby, likely some underpaid university tutor with a cloud of chalk dust in his hair, waves it off. It happens, he mutters. That's the 4th today. On the wall hangs a large wooden globe, neatly sliced into lines of latitude and longitude. Mercator's projection tried to flatten that globe into something usable at sea. The cost? A Greenland the size of South America. But hey, nobody said math was fair. Quirky tidbit. Mercator's projection was originally meant for navigation only, not education, not textbooks, and definitely not classroom walls. But somewhere along the line, it stuck. Possibly because people just liked maps that looked like rectangles. Square pegs, round Earth. You step into a port office where a ship's navigator is explaining to a group of half-listening apprentices how to chart a course using Mercator lines. He uses a long piece of twine, stretches it diagonally across a paper map, then adjusts for magnetic variation. You nod as if you understand. You don't. Historians still argue whether Mercator fully grasped how long-lasting his projection would become. Was it genius design or lucky timing? Some say it was just a practical tool that caught on because the age of exploration was booming. Others credit Mercator with a deeper understanding of navigation's future than he ever let on. Outside, a map seller is unrolling copies for sailors preparing to brave the Atlantic. Their charts shimmer faintly with wax, and inked coastlines bleed slightly where salt air has kissed the parchment too often. You pick one up and examine the handwriting, delicate, flowing, and completely illegible. Classic cartographer. Down by the docks, a captain barks orders. The crew loads barrels, and somewhere in the back someone is arguing about how many degrees to deviate to avoid storms near the Azores. You sneak a peek at their Mercator chart and wince. It shows a straight line across an ocean known for being anything but. But therein lies the irony. Mercator's straight lines weren't always the fastest path, just the easiest to draw. On a globe, the shortest route between 2 points is a curve, a great circle. Try explaining that to a sailor who just wants to avoid crashing into a whale. You find yourself seated beside an apprentice mapmaker, painstakingly copying a Mercator chart. She dips her quill into ink and whispers under her breath as she works. 90 degrees. 90 degrees. You ask her how long it takes to draw a map like this. She laughs. Longer than the journey it's for. As twilight falls, the candlelight flickers across dozens of charts and projections, each one a different interpretation of the same planet. Mercator's is just one of many, but it's become the standard. Probably because humans like things that are easy to fold. You trace your finger across the bloated Greenland one more time, smiling. Somewhere, Mercator might be chuckling too. Not because he got it all right, but because he helped the world feel a little more navigable, even if the edges are still fuzzy. You're trudging through a muddy field now, boots sinking with every step, surrounded by men dragging a long, rattling chain through the grass. No, it's not a bizarre tug-of-war tournament. This is 17th century land surveying, and that chain, it's your most accurate friend in the world, assuming you like friends that are cold, heavy, and annoyingly tangle-prone. Mainstream historical fact. In 1620, an English clergyman named Edmund Gunter introduced a standardised measuring tool called Gunter's chain. It was exactly 66 feet long and divided into 100 links, allowing surveyors to easily calculate acres and other land measurements. Gunter's chain quickly became a staple in field surveying across Europe and later in the American colonies. You watch as a team of sweaty assistants, one at the front, one at the rear, stretch the chain taut along the landscape. When they hit an obstruction, like a prickly hedge or a cow with poor manners, they simply mark the endpoint and start again on the other side. It's slow, wet work, but remarkably precise. Quirky tidbit. The term chain stuck around for centuries as a unit of measure, even showing up in railroad construction. There's something poetic about entire locomotives being guided by a tool once dragged through a sheep pasture by a guy with soggy socks. You pull out a notebook and start jotting down measurements as one of the crew shouts, 12 chains and 20 links. You smile and nod, pretending you're not wildly confused. Who needs GPS when you have fractions and shouting? The land around you is being turned into property, mapped, measured, and assigned value. A nearby landowner rides up on a horse, points vaguely at a hill and says, "That'll be mine, I suppose." The surveyor sighs and asks him to stand very still while they measure around him. Historians still argue whether the widespread adoption of Gunter's chain was due more to its mathematical elegance, or simply because no one could come up with a better alternative. It may not have been glamorous, but it worked. Over time, entire regions were parcelled out using its rhythm. You wander toward a thatched roof tavern where a map hangs behind the bar, sketched from chains and rods, marking out who owns what. Some of the boundaries are comically crooked. Lines swerving around boulders or trees that refuse to move. Surveyors might have been accurate, but they were also practical. If you can't measure through the cow, measure around it. Further down the lane, you peek into a wooden shed filled with measuring rods, compasses, and plumb bobs. The tools look like torture devices from a Renaissance escape room, yet each one played a role in creating the maps and property lines that still govern land ownership today. One man offers to show you how to square a corner, using only a rope with knots spaced evenly apart. He demonstrates the ancient 3-4-5 triangle trick, creating a perfect right angle using nothing more than rope and patience. You try it yourself and promptly trip over the rope. The man nods. That's how most maps start. You sit down on a fence post as the sun dips low, casting long shadows over the field. The chain glints faintly in the grass, now resting after a long day's drag. These simple, manual tools, touched by dirt, rain, and human error, mapped kingdoms and colonies alike. They laid out roads, defined borders, and fueled arguments that lasted generations. You realise something humbling. Even before satellites and lasers, humanity was obsessed with knowing where things were and where we stood in relation to them. Not just out of curiosity, but out of necessity. Measuring land meant claiming it, taxing it, fighting over it. Every inch mattered, and as your eyelids grow heavy, the rhythm of the measuring team echoes in your head like a lullaby. Chain, link, mark, move. A strange poetry of early precision, whispered through the ages by muddy boots and iron links. You're now ascending a lumpy French hillside, huffing slightly, and wondering why the best scientific breakthroughs always seem to require either freezing or sweating. Around you, men in tricorn hats are setting up telescopes, flags, and very long rods. You, my friend, are in the middle of the Great French Triangulation, where 18th century cartographers tried to measure an entire country, using only math, hills, and an alarming amount of patience. Mainstream historical fact. During the late 1700s, France launched one of the most ambitious geodetic projects of its time, the creation of the metric system's base unit, the metre. This meant measuring a portion of the meridian running from Dunkirk to Barcelona to calculate the Earth's curvature. The scientists, most famously Pierre Méchain and Jean-Baptiste Delambre, used a technique called triangulation, climbing hills and towers to measure precise angles between distant points. You're invited to hold one end of a huge survey rod while two men at a distant hill shout cryptic numbers at each other, the other guy's yelling something about arcs cons, and you're standing there like a glorified scarecrow with no idea what's going on. Still, it feels important. Quirky tidbit. Méchain, ever the perfectionist, was so tormented by a slight miscalculation in his data that he kept it secret for years, even while being hailed as a scientific hero. Historians still debate whether he would have preferred the truth to mathematical accuracy or vice versa. This man essentially invented imposter syndrome before it was trendy. You're ushered down the hill and into a cluttered tent where maps are being sketched with alarming speed. Triangles crisscross the countryside like a spider web spun by a very organised spider with a protractor. This is triangulation in action. By measuring one baseline and two angles, you can calculate the exact distance to distant objects, even over hills, rivers, or politically inconvenient duchies. Historians still argue whether this French endeavour was purely scientific or also politically charged. After all, defining the metre wasn't just about logic, it was about national pride. France wanted to lead the world in rational standards, and nothing says rational like standing on a volcano to measure an imaginary line through Spain. You now find yourself on a church bell tower, holding your breath beside an astronomer who's carefully aligning his theodolite with a faraway flag fluttering on another peak. There's something almost poetic about this moment. Man, machine, and mountain in quiet harmony. Down below, the village children giggle and point. They've never seen someone use an expensive instrument to stare at a hill. You wave, they wave back. You drop the lens cap. It bounces once, twice, and disappears into a pile of hay. So much for scientific precision. Later, around a crackling fire, you listen to Delambre explain how the entire globe can, in theory, be sliced up with this method. Triangulate from one solid base and keep extending. Theoretically, you could map the moon this way if you had tall enough tripods and no clouds. A local priest brings wine. You clink tin cups with exhausted surveyors and stare into the flames, thinking about how they've been hauling telescopes and notebooks through forests and cities for years, dodging political revolutions and suspicious farmers, all for the sake of one perfect unit of measurement. And finally, as dawn breaks over another mountain, you help pack up the instruments. The chain is coiled, the angles recorded, and the data, the precious data, is inked into a leather-bound journal. That number they were chasing, it'll become the metre, not a king's foot, not a sacred cubit, just a logical slice of earth itself. The world, at least in France, will soon be measured by reason. You're now bobbing gently aboard a creaky 18th century ship somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic, surrounded by salt air, squawking gulls, and a group of anxious sailors who are, let's say, less than confident about where they actually are. You've entered the realm of the Great Longitude Problem, a mystery so infuriating that it confounded empires and bankrupted more than a few captains. Mainstream historical fact. For centuries, sailors could easily measure their latitude, their position north or south, by using the angle of the sun or stars above the horizon. But longitude, east-west positioning, that was the nightmare. You couldn't just look up to find it. Ships drifted wildly off course, and the lack of precise positioning led to wrecks, starvation, and the occasional very grumpy admiral. Today's adventure is brought to you by poor navigation and wealthy governments desperate to stop crashing their navies into islands. You lean over the side as the crew fumbles with an hourglass, trying to mark time between observations. Back then, one of the best ways to calculate longitude was comparing local time, based on the sun, to the time at a known reference point, say Greenwich. But the only problem was clocks. No, really. Accurate clocks didn't exist at sea. Pendulums don't work so well when the floor keeps moving, in case you haven't noticed. Quirky tidbit. In the early 1700s, Britain got so fed up with maritime disasters that it offered the Longitude Prize, a whopping $20,000, to anyone who could devise a reliable way to measure longitude at sea. That's millions in today's money. The scientific world went into full Shark Tank mode. You're ushered into a tiny shipboard workshop cluttered with springs and brass gears. Here, meet John Harrison, a self-taught carpenter and clockmaker with an obsession. His sea clocks, known as marine chronometers, would eventually solve the problem by keeping time with jaw-dropping accuracy. The man basically invented the Fitbit of the 18th century, minus the step count and plus a lot of salty air. Historians still argue whether Harrison was a genius misunderstood by the scientific elite, or a stubborn tinkerer who got lucky. He built not one, but 4 versions of his chronometer, each better than the last. But for decades, the prize committee delayed recognising his work, insisting that astronomy might still provide a better solution. Spoiler alert, it didn't. You're now standing below deck beside a ticking marvel, Harrison's H4. It looks like a large pocket watch, but it's more accurate than anything else afloat. With it, a ship can now compare local noon to Greenwich time and determine how far east or west it's drifted. Suddenly, ships are landing where they're supposed to instead of wherever Neptune flings them. Out on deck, the navigator uses a sextant to catch the sun's angle at high noon. He jots down the time. Then he opens the chronometer, still ticking steadily despite weeks of storms and a near mutiny over soggy biscuits. He subtracts the 2 times, multiplies by 15 degrees per hour, and voila, longitude. You look at the stars that night, listening to sailors hum softly as they trim sails and whisper their hopes for safe passage. They don't understand the mechanics of the chronometer, but they trust it. Trust, built on gears and springs. The captain joins you by the rail, telling stories of ships lost before these clocks existed. Entire fleets smashed on unseen reefs, thinking they were hundreds of miles from danger. One disaster in 1707 killed nearly 2,000 men when 4 British ships miscalculated their longitude and wrecked off the Isles of Scilly. Harrison, who spent his life fine-tuning brass and battling bureaucracy, made sure that wouldn't happen again. By the time you reach port, the chronometer has lost only a few seconds. Just enough time for you to appreciate the difference between somewhere out there and exactly here. And when your feet hit dry land again, you feel something shift. Not in the earth beneath you, but in your mind. For the first time, humans can confidently say where they are on a spinning globe, at any moment, anywhere. All thanks to a guy who built clocks in his barn and wouldn't take no for an answer. You're squinting now beneath the thick green canopy of colonial America, swatting at something that may or may not be a mosquito the size of a pigeon. In your hand, a compass. In front of you, a straight line through utter wilderness. You've joined the team laying down the Mason-Dixon line, arguably one of the most famous boundary lines in history, and one that was painstakingly measured without a single satellite in the sky. Mainstream historical fact. In the 1760s, British astronomers Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon were hired to resolve a land dispute between the colonies of Pennsylvania and Maryland. The issue? Their original charters overlapped, and the only solution was to literally measure the landscape and draw the line. With telescopes, chains, and old-school astronomical skills, Mason and Dixon cut a precise boundary that would later take on deep symbolic meaning in American history. You push through underbrush as the survey party inches forward, pausing every so often to hammer a stake or line up a crosshair through a telescope mounted on a tripod. These aren't just random measurements, they're meticulous triangulations, calculated through celestial observations taken at night and repeated mile by mile, tree by stubborn tree. Fringe tidbit. Mason and Dixon were interrupted at one point by a local legend, Delaware's so-called walking purchase, a shady land grab based on how far men could walk in a day. The story spooked some indigenous tribes, who refused to let the survey line pass through their territory. Mason and Dixon, weary and respectful, agreed to stop short. Historians still argue whether this break in the line was due to politics, ethics, or good old-fashioned survival instinct. You pause beside a stone marker freshly planted in the soil. It's one of hundreds, each engraved with an M on one side and a P on the other, placed exactly every mile. Every 5th mile, a crown stone, engraved with the crests of the Penn and Calvert families. Yes, someone actually carved those crests by hand in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but bugs and bears for company. You pat the stone gently, half expecting it to hum with colonial tension. At night, Mason and Dixon would bring out their zenith sector, a huge telescope used to track the movement of stars. By recording when a specific star crossed the zenith, directly overhead, they could determine their latitude with remarkable precision. It's science, sure, but it's also a little magical, watching humans stitch the heavens to the earth with angles and timepieces. Your boots crunch through leaves as you walk their path. Mason, the quiet stargazer, Dixon, the cheerful engineer. Together they forge not only a boundary but a brotherhood, traipsing through snow, forests and occasional colonial awkwardness to resolve a geopolitical mess with math and grit. They faced more than just geography. At one point their instruments were impounded by local authorities suspicious of foreigners wielding mysterious gear. "We're just measuring," they insisted, which is always what spies say. You share a cup of strong coffee with the crew near a campfire that smells faintly of bacon grease and scientific frustration. A local blacksmith sharpens a tool under torchlight, shaking his head at how anyone could spend years drawing a straight line through this madness. You agree, then help measure another chain length before the sun disappears again. And what does this line eventually become? Beyond just a colonial boundary, it's later embraced as the symbolic divide between North and South during the Civil War era. Mason and Dixon couldn't have known, but their careful measurements would echo through history, repeated in textbooks, arguments and songs for centuries to come. You trudge forward with them, another mile marker in hand, another star chart to consult. There's no GPS to save you, no glowing blue dot to guide your steps, just math, patience, and a whole lot of walking. At some point you stop and look up at the sky. It's breathtakingly clear, uncluttered by smog or satellite trails. The stars wheel above, indifferent to your slow progress but always there to guide it. And somewhere in that vast, crisp silence, it hits you. This was how nations were built, not in marble halls or battlefield charges, but one dusty measurement at a time. You're up early now, earlier than anyone should be, and trudging through damp grass on the edge of the Scottish Highlands. The air smells like moss, sheep, and determination. Ahead of you is a tripod taller than a grown man and a box of complicated math in brass form. Today, you're joining a team of 19th century surveyors on one of the most ambitious undertakings of its age, mapping the shape of the Earth itself by climbing as many foggy peaks as humanly and inhumanly possible. Mainstream historical fact: the Great Trigonometrical Survey wasn't just a British project in India. Around the same time, geodesists across Europe, especially in Britain and France, were working to determine the precise size and shape of the Earth. Contrary to what your elementary school globe might suggest, the Earth isn't a perfect sphere. It's a slightly squished ellipsoid, thanks to that pesky thing called rotation. You haul a heavy theodolite up a slope so steep your knees are rethinking their commitment. Once at the top, you help set it up next to a tall signal beacon. Today's job: measure angles between this mountaintop and two others that you can barely see through the low cloud cover. You're just praying it doesn't start raining sideways. Again, quirky tidbit. In the British Survey of India, one of the peaks measured during this global mapping craze was originally labelled Peak 15. It would later be renamed Mount Everest, after the surveyor who didn't even want it named after him. Historians still argue whether Everest himself ever even saw the mountain, or whether the whole naming was just an act of bureaucratic flattery gone rogue. As you peer through the theodolite, you adjust a micrometer knob no wider than your fingernail. The aim? Precision down to the arc second, about 1/3600 of a degree. It's the cartographic equivalent of threading a needle, from across a valley, in the fog, while wearing mittens. Later you gather around a chalkboard with your sleep-deprived colleagues, working out a massive triangle, using a known baseline measured to within fractions of an inch. From that base, and two measured angles, you calculate distances to other stations, leapfrogging your way across entire countries with nothing but triangles and trig tables. It's kind of like giant geometry homework, but the kind where bears might show up. Night falls. You lie on your back beside a cold rock, scribbling observations by lantern light. Nearby, a surveyor complains that the Earth's bulge near the equator is throwing off his calculations. It's like trying to measure a deflating football, he grumbles. You nod sagely, unsure if he means a soccer ball or some forgotten metaphor about gravity. What's wild is how much of this process depends not just on math, but trust. Every person in this chain of measurements is relying on the last one to have been accurate. A single bad angle or a warped measuring rod, and your mountain is now located somewhere in the North Sea. Historians still argue whether these early geodesists fully understood the regional variations in gravity that could warp their results. Some thought the Himalayas, for example, were made of denser rock and thus pulled on measuring instruments. Turns out, they were wrong. The opposite was true. But at the time, it was like trying to balance a ruler on a trampoline while guessing the fabric's tension. By dawn, you're back at base camp, face windburned and hair pointing in 4 directions. A kettle whistles over the fire, and your crew toasts another successful angle with a tin cup of weak tea. It's not glamorous, but it is monumental. This is how the world is stitched together, mountaintop to mountaintop, with notes, sweat and trust. And once the data is finally crunched and compiled, the result is a new global model, one that helps ships sail straighter, borders settle cleaner, and scientists dream bigger. Eventually, satellites will replace these hardy hill climbers, but those metal birds in the sky? They're still following lines first drawn by cold, tired people with protractors and frostbite. So, next time you open your GPS and wonder how it knows your exact location, remember this. It started on a mountain in the fog, with a very stubborn human staring through a telescope and mumbling, "That's probably close enough." You're now ankle-deep in sand, standing next to a camel who clearly resents your existence, while a French military officer mutters something about triangles and destiny. Welcome to Napoleon's Egypt, an unlikely birthplace for one of the most critical surveying missions in scientific history. The goal? To establish the very foundation of measurement itself, the meter, mainstream historical fact. In the late 18th century, as revolution reshaped France, so too did the desire to create a universal system of weights and measures. The new metric system would rely not on the length of a king's foot or the width of a barley corn, but on the earth itself. Specifically, they wanted to define the meter as 1/10,000,000th of the distance from the North Pole to the equator, along a meridian that passed through Paris. Simple enough, right? You just need to measure the planet, so off they went. Jean-Baptiste Delambre and Pierre Méchain, 2 scientists tasked with measuring a meridian arc from Dunkirk to Barcelona. You're following their ghostly footsteps now, from damp northern skies to blinding Mediterranean heat. The process? Triangulation again. Because when you're measuring Earth's curvature, triangles are your best friends and your worst nightmares. Fringe tidbit: Méchain, the southern half of the team, ran into all sorts of problems: mountains, political unrest, war, and eventually a horrible realization. He had made a calculation error in his data. The man was so distraught, he refused to publish his results and reportedly died, still tormented by the mistake. Historians still argue whether Méchain's guilt was warranted, or whether his anxiety was amplified by the immense pressure of redefining the world standard. Back in Paris, officials waited impatiently as the data trickled in, hoping to finally nail down a consistent, rational unit of length. You wipe sweat from your brow as the team hauls telescopes up bell towers, cathedral spires, and remote peaks to measure tiny angular differences. All of this so they can say, definitively, this is a meter. You lean against a stone trig point, imagining the sheer audacity of the mission. They wanted to create a measurement system based not on tradition, but on nature. Something elegant, democratic, and scientifically sound. No more king's inches or local foot lengths, just clean cosmic clarity. At night, the crew lays on their backs, double-checking the positions of specific stars to refine their latitude readings. Every angle measured is tied to celestial objects, linking the heavens directly to Earth's geometry. It's romantic, if you ignore the dysentery and banditry. And how do they physically record the meter? Once they've determined the Earth's curvature from Dunkirk to Barcelona, they cut a platinum bar to that exact dimension, 1/10,000,000th of the quarter meridian. Voila, the meter is born. The original prototype was stored in a triple-locked vault and kissed regularly by science nerds in powdered wigs. But you can't help but feel a little pang for Méchain. He never forgave himself for his minor error, even though the final measurement, 1 metre, was so incredibly close to modern values that we're still using it today. Well, sort of. It's now defined by the speed of light, but that's another late-night video. As you follow their route along the coast of Spain, you pass landmarks once used as survey stations, churches, lighthouses, remote barns, where telescopes once hummed with cosmic intent. You can almost hear their footfalls echoing behind yours. Every stone step, every shouted number, every careful sketch in a leather-bound logbook, all in service of measuring something no one could ever truly see. Historians still argue whether the project was as purely scientific as it seemed, or if it was also a political statement, a way to unify the chaos of revolutionary France under a clean, rational system. Probably both. Humans rarely do anything monumental without at least a little agenda. Eventually you reach the final station near Barcelona and watch as they etch the last number into their notes. The journey has taken 7 grueling years, but now humanity has a universal unit, a meter. One small line on a platinum bar, born from 1,000 triangles, a few nervous breakdowns, and a lot of telescope time. And you? You carry that meter in your pocket every time you check a road sign, measure your height, or buy a 2-litre bottle of soda. All thanks to 2 guys who thought, let's measure the Earth, and meant it. You find yourself trudging across a frozen expanse now, your breath fogging in the air as sleet needles your cheeks and wind roars past your ears like a vengeful ghost. You're in 19th century Russia, because apparently surveying the world wasn't quite difficult enough already. What better place to finish mapping the vast, harsh edges of empires than Siberia? Mainstream historical fact, the Russian Empire, with its seemingly endless terrain, needed accurate maps not just for trade and taxation, but for military logistics and imperial control. Surveyors, called zemlema, or land measurers, were sent out on grueling expeditions through tundra, taiga, and mountain ranges. Many were young engineers from military academies, and what did they carry? Chains, sextants, barometers, and a stubbornness only vodka could sustain. The sky is iron grey. The forest is an unbroken monotone of frostbitten pine. You and your team are laying down one of the final segments of the Struve geodetic arc, an extraordinary multi-nation project aimed at measuring the exact size and shape of the Earth. It stretches from Hammerfest in Norway all the way down to the Black Sea, covering over 2,800 kilometres. Not bad for a bunch of guys with bad maps and frostbite. Fringe tidbit. In some parts of the Ark, surveyors actually had to negotiate with suspicious local villagers who thought their instruments were devil tools or foreign witchcraft. To calm tensions, some reportedly pretended the strange gadgets were religious relics, or even musical instruments. Historians still argue whether this tactic was clever diplomacy or just pure desperation in the face of hostile pitchforks. You pause beside a small pile of rocks, one of the many fixed triangulation points still visible today. Some of these points were so well built that UNESCO eventually gave them World Heritage status. And here you are, sitting on one like it's just a particularly uncomfortable bench. Progress. The measuring process here is the same dance as before, long baselines measured with iron rods adjusted for temperature, followed by angular measurements taken between mountaintop stations. But here in the Arctic wilderness, mountaintop often means a frozen hill occupied by a very territorial snow fox. You let it have the high ground and recalibrate a few feet lower. Your team scribbles calculations on waterproofed parchment while trying not to spill ink in the wind. Even lighting a lantern feels like a minor miracle, and when night falls, the aurora borealis flickers above as if the heavens themselves are watching your math homework with mild amusement. And what was the point of this epic effort? To answer a fundamental question: how big is this planet and how is it shaped? The results would contribute to understanding the Earth's ellipsoidal shape, variations in gravity, and would form the backbone of all future global positioning systems. No pressure. By now you've learned that old-school measurement was never just about distances. It was about power. Whoever mapped the land claimed it. Whoever measured it taxed it. And whoever drew the borders held the narrative. You're not just logging numbers, you're scripting geopolitical history, one frostbitten triangulation at a time. At a brief stop in a small Siberian town, you warm your fingers over a crude iron stove and glance at a wall map drawn decades earlier. It's mostly guesswork. Mountains where there are plains, rivers bending the wrong way. Soon, thanks to your crew, that map will be redrawn with real accuracy. It's humbling and exhausting and weirdly thrilling. Historians still argue whether the Struviarch's success came from consistent methodology or from the sheer stubbornness of the crews who refused to stop for wolves, blizzards, or political revolutions. Probably both. Humans can do incredible things when they have math and fear of failure on their side. As the survey lines stretch onward, through snowfields and over the Ural Mountains, you begin to see how the entire world was slowly stitched together. Triangle by triangle, from one stubborn measurement to the next. And long before any satellite blinked awake above your head, the Earth was already quietly being measured, by foot, by hand, and by star. You sit now on the edge of a quiet hill as dawn begins to melt the last traces of frost from the grass beneath you. The measuring rods are packed away, the telescopes draped in cloth, and your logbooks finally filled with careful numbers, ink-stained calculations, and the doodles of boredom scrawled during rain delays. You've come to the end of the world, at least the world as it was known before satellites, computers, and orbital charts. You helped measure it, one triangle at a time, mainstream historical fact. Before GPS blanketed the globe in digital precision, humanity's understanding of geography, of the distances between towns, of the rise and fall of mountains, of borders and coastlines, was shaped by generations of surveyors, explorers and mathematicians. The oldest accurate longitudinal measurements were often made by people perched on rooftops with pendulums and sextants, calculating their place in the universe with tools that, by today's standards, feel almost primitive. You lean back and think of all those who came before you. The Egyptian rope stretchers who measured fields after the Nile flooded. The Greek polymaths who tried to calculate Earth's circumference using nothing but shadows and ambition. The Roman agrimensors who etched invisible lines of property and power across Europe. And the tired but triumphant men of the Enlightenment who insisted that the world could be measured, that it should be understood. Quirky tidbit. The French even once proposed renaming the entire calendar and reorganising the day into decimal hours. 10 hours in a day, 100 minutes per hour, 100 seconds per minute. It didn't last, but the spirit of it lingers in how we think of measurement, clean, mathematical, and sometimes totally impractical when it comes to actual human schedules. Historians still argue whether pre-modern measurements, so often biased by politics, weather and personality, can ever be considered truly accurate. Some claim they were marvels of precision given their context. Others call them elaborate guesstimates wrapped in ceremonial robes and national flags. The truth probably floats somewhere in the middle, like a compass needle that wobbles just before it settles. And now you're here, with satellites twinkling above your head. They're constantly talking to your phone, letting you order takeout with the same math that once took months of climbing mountains and dodging malaria. You wonder how many people still think of the sweat, the frostbite, and the quiet dedication it took to build the systems we now treat like magic. You rise and look around. Every road sign, every mile marker, every map app that gets you from your couch to your dentist, they all trace back to this history. The slow, deliberate measurement of a chaotic world by people who refuse to settle for close enough. As you walk back toward camp, boots crunching softly in the grass, the stars fade with the morning light. For centuries those stars were the guideposts of explorers and surveyors alike, silent companions in the eternal question of where, exactly, am I? Now your phone tells you instantly, but once it took the cosmos. And maybe, just maybe, something was gained in that long process of measuring by hand, a sense of scale, not just geographical, but human. That we are small, yes, but we are clever and persistent, and really, really bad at accepting that we don't know exactly how far it is from Paris to Barcelona. You exhale. The world has been measured, but the story of how we did it, well, that was the real journey all along. Word count 1096, wind down, 300 words. And now, as your eyes grow heavier and the world softens around the edges, let the pace of thought slow to a gentle drift. Picture those ancient surveyors again, not in the middle of their work, but resting, curled near a glowing oil lamp, their notes set aside, the long day's calculations fading into quiet memory. The mountains no longer loom. They rest like sleeping giants under a pale sky. The stars, those silent guides that once ruled the night, now twinkle faintly above, no longer demanding your attention, only offering their calm, distant glow. Let your breath deepen. Let your limbs settle. The footsteps of history echo more softly now, like fading chalk lines on a well-worn map. No need to keep track of every mile, every angle, every shift of the compass. For tonight, you're exactly where you need to be, held in a quiet moment between centuries of movement. The earth turns slowly, imperceptibly, as it always has. The ancient tools are packed away, the triangles closed, the distances resolved. The questions will still be there tomorrow, but tonight, there is only stillness. Close your eyes. Let the sound of the wind through old cartographers' tents, the ticking of pocket watches, and the distant call of owls lull you into a deeper peace. You are floating now, not above the earth, but within it, measured and known, resting inside the lines drawn by those who came before. Sleep, traveller. The world has been mapped. The stars are back in their places. And you are home. 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 You are home.